The morning sun filtered through the big glass windows of the old music academy, casting soft light on the rows of polished instruments. The hall smelled faintly of wood polish and floor cleaner. In one corner, a quiet man moved with steady hands, wiping dust off the grand piano. His gray uniform was neatly pressed, his shoes a bit worn, and his back slightly bent from years of work. Everyone knew him as the janitor. He came early every morning before the students arrived and often stayed long after they left. He didn't talk much, but he always greeted people with a small smile and a polite nod. Most students didn't even remember his name. To them, he was just the man with the mop, someone who blended into the background. When they passed him in the hallway, they might say a quick good morning, but they never really looked at him. He was invisible in a place full of bright lights, music, and ambition. Every day, he cleaned the same practice rooms, emptying bins filled with music sheets and snack wrappers, wiping down the same shiny pianos that others used to perform. Sometimes, when no one was around, he would pause for a few seconds near the piano, gently touching the keys. His eyes would soften as he pressed one or two notes, so quietly that the sound barely filled the room. Then, almost as if he remembered where he was, he would smile to himself and get back to work. The students often joked about how strange it was that a janitor worked in a music academy. Some whispered that he probably never even touched an instrument in his life. They never imagined that behind that calm face and those quiet eyes lived a man who once had a deep connection with music, deeper than any of them could have guessed. He didn't mind the way people looked past him. He had learned to live quietly. Life had taught him that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. He found comfort in small things. The rhythm of the broom against the floor, the smell of freshly cleaned rooms, the distant sound of students practicing. Each day felt the same, but he carried a sense of peace in his routine. One afternoon, when the classes were almost over, a few students stayed behind in the large hall. They were practicing for an upcoming piano competition. Laughter echoed through the room as they teased each other about missing notes and wrong chords. The janitor was there too, mopping the floor at the far end of the hall. He moved quietly, careful not to disturb anyone. But his presence caught the attention of one of the students, a tall boy who liked to joke around. "Hey," the boy called out with a grin. "Mr. Janitor, you're always cleaning this piano. You ever think about playing it?" His friends laughed, finding the idea funny. The janitor looked up for a moment, a gentle smile on his face. He didn't seem offended, just calm, as if the words didn't sting at all. "I don't think you'd be interested in hearing me," he said softly, his voice calm and kind. That made the group laugh even louder. "Come on," another student added, "it's just a piano. Anyone can press a few keys, right?" The teasing continued for a while, harmless in their minds, but thoughtless all the same. They had no idea what they were really asking. He didn't reply right away. Instead, he looked at the piano, the same one he cleaned every day, polished until it shone. He placed the mop against the wall, wiped his hands on a cloth he kept in his pocket, and walked toward it. The laughter slowly faded as the students realized he might actually take them up on the challenge. The janitor pulled out the bench, sat down slowly, and rested his fingers on the keys. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of memories. For a few seconds he didn't play. He just sat there, breathing softly, feeling the smooth ivory under his fingertips. The room grew quiet except for the faint sound of the ceiling fan. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed the first key. The sound that came out wasn't random or clumsy. It was warm, full, and gentle. The students stopped whispering. They stood still, their laughter frozen mid-air. The janitor's fingers moved gracefully across the keys, flowing from one note to another like he'd done it all his life. The melody filled the hall, wrapping around everyone like a soft blanket. It wasn't a song they recognized, but it carried emotion. Deep, powerful, and honest. Each note seemed to tell a story. It spoke of love and loss, of quiet nights and heavy hearts, of moments when life didn't go the way one hoped. The students could feel something in the air they couldn't describe, something that made their chests tighten. The janitor wasn't just playing a piano. He was pouring his soul into it. The piece grew softer, slower, until it ended with a single note that lingered in the air. For a long moment, no one said a word. The students just stood there, eyes wide, as if they had witnessed something magical. The man who they thought only knew how to sweep floors had just played like a professional. No, like an artist. It didn't make sense to them. How could someone who worked as a janitor play like that? Finally, one of the students spoke, his voice low and unsure. That was amazing. Where did you learn to play like that? The janitor smiled gently but didn't answer. He simply stood up, placed the piano bench back in its place, and went to pick up his mop again. Just something I used to do a long time ago, he said softly. The group watched in silence as he went back to cleaning the floor, as if nothing had happened. But for the students, everything had changed. They couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Something about the way he played, the quiet strength in his movements, stayed with them. After he left, the students sat in front of the same piano, trying to play a few notes. But no matter what they did, they couldn't make it sound the way he had. Their notes felt empty, mechanical, missing the emotion that had filled his music. They realized that skill wasn't just about practice or talent. It was about feeling, about the heart behind every sound. Later that evening, as the janitor finished his shift, he passed by the empty hall again. The lights were dim now, and the piano sat silently in the middle of the room. He stopped for a moment and smiled at it like an old friend he hadn't spoken to in a while. Then he turned off the lights and walked out, his footsteps echoing softly behind him. That night, some of the students couldn't stop thinking about him. They had laughed at him without knowing anything about his past. Now they were curious. Who was he really? Why did someone with that kind of talent end up working as a janitor? None of them had the courage to ask, but they all silently promised themselves that the next time they saw him, they would treat him differently. The next morning, when he arrived early as usual, the same students were already there. They greeted him politely, something they had never done before. He nodded with his usual gentle smile and began his work. As he cleaned, one of them quietly sat at the piano and played the few notes he remembered from the previous day. It didn't sound the same, but the effort made the janitor smile faintly. From that day on, something small but beautiful began to change inside that music academy. The students who once ignored the janitor started noticing the little things. The way he took care of the instruments, how carefully he moved around them, how he always seemed to understand music even when he didn't play. They began to sense there was a deeper story hidden behind his quietness. No one knew yet what that story was. But one thing was certain. After hearing him play, they would never look at him as just the janitor again. Something about his presence had shifted the air in that hall. His music had touched something in each of them that words could never express. And while he never spoke much, the quiet man carried on with his routine, sweeping, cleaning, and humming softly to himself. But this time, when people passed by, they didn't ignore him. Some smiled, some nodded, and a few even stayed a little longer, hoping to hear him touch the piano keys again someday. The next morning, the music academy felt different. The sunlight poured through the tall windows, painting warm patches on the polished floor. The janitor arrived just as he always did, pushing open the heavy glass door and stepping into the quiet building. The smell of wood polish and piano keys greeted him like an old friend. He carried his cleaning supplies in his arms, his uniform neat, his shoes slightly worn but polished. For the first time in a long while, he noticed that some of the students were already in the hall. They were whispering among themselves, glancing at him every so often. He gave them a soft nod, his usual gentle smile in place, and went about his work. The mop brushed rhythmically against the floor, the sound blending with the distant echo of footsteps and voices. One of the students, a girl with short hair and bright eyes, stepped forward hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said softly. Her voice was calm, not teasing like the day before. Would you show us something else on the piano?" The janitor looked at her for a moment, a quiet surprise in his eyes. He had not expected anyone to ask that, and especially not politely. "I don't know if you'd enjoy it," he said gently, but there was no mockery in his voice, no hint of frustration. He only had a calm patience that seemed to fill the room. The students gathered closer, standing quietly, their curiosity stronger than before. They had laughed at him yesterday, yes, but now they wanted to understand. They wanted to see the person behind the quiet smile and the soft hands that cleaned their instruments. He set down his mop and moved slowly toward the piano. His fingers rested lightly on the keys for a few moments, almost as if greeting an old friend. Then he began to play. The notes started softly like whispers in a quiet room. The melody carried a gentle sadness, but also a beauty that was impossible to ignore. The students watched in awe as his hands moved gracefully, each finger deliberate, each chord speaking more than words ever could. The tune seemed to tell a story of patience, of years spent in quiet solitude, of moments missed but never forgotten. As the music filled the hall, a few students felt a lump form in their throats. It was strange, the way someone so ordinary in appearance could create something so extraordinary. They realized then that what they had thought about him, that he was just a janitor, a background presence, someone to ignore, was entirely wrong. The music revealed a truth they hadn't seen before. This man carried something precious inside him, something no one had noticed. When he paused, even for a brief moment, the room held its breath. His eyes met theirs for the first time as he said quietly, "Music has always been a part of me. Even now, even here, I can't let it go." His voice was soft, almost fragile, but it carried the weight of experience of life lived with both joy and sorrow. The students didn't speak immediately. They were too stunned, too captivated to interrupt the story his music was telling. One of them finally stepped closer, her voice trembling slightly. You used to play before?" The janitor nodded, a small sad smile on his face. "A long time ago," he said. "I played in small halls with an audience with people who clapped, but life sometimes takes things from you." His eyes, calm and steady, seemed to reflect a quiet sadness. He didn't need to say more. The students felt it, the weight of the years, the loss, and the quiet resignation in his tone. The girl with short hair asked carefully, "Why did you stop?" He took a slow breath, and for a moment it seemed he was somewhere else remembering. Life demanded it, family, responsibilities, things I could not ignore. Music had to wait, and then, time passed. His voice softened, almost a whisper now. "And I stayed here, close to music, but not in the way I wanted." The students listened, rapt. They realized that life had not been easy for him. It had been full of sacrifices, choices made under pressure, and dreams quietly put aside. They had laughed at him yesterday without knowing the depth of his story. Now, hearing him speak, seeing the way he played, they felt a mix of shame and admiration. They had underestimated him in the worst way. One of the boys, the same one who had teased him the day before, spoke hesitantly. I didn't know. I'm sorry." The janitor gave a small nod, accepting the apology without anger. "It's all right," he said softly. "People laugh when they don't understand. That is normal." His calmness was surprising, and the boy felt a warmth in his chest, a lesson being quietly given without words. The janitor returned to the piano and played again. This time, the melody was lighter, almost playful, but still carried an emotion that seemed to reach into the hearts of the students. They realized something important. Music was not just about talent or technique. It was about experience, about life itself. Every note he played was a reflection of the path he had walked. The quiet moments, the losses, and the small joys. Hours passed as the students stayed, listening, asking small questions, and trying to understand the music and the man behind it. He answered each question patiently, never rushing, never judging. He told them about the first time he had touched a piano, about the teachers who had believed in him, about the performances that had filled him with joy. He also spoke gently about the hardships, about the moments when life had pulled him away from the stage. The students realized that he had carried both joy and sorrow in equal measure, and that balance had made his music alive, real, and unforgettable. One of the students asked him why he never returned to performing professionally. The janitor paused, looking down at his hands resting on the keys. "Sometimes life gives us a role we don't expect. This work allows me to be near music. I may not play in grand halls anymore, but I am here. I can still touch the piano. I can still create sound. That is enough for me." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that left the students quiet. They began to see him differently. The quiet janitor was no longer invisible. He was a man who had lived, a man who had loved music deeply, and a man who had continued despite everything. The students' laughter from the previous day felt distant and wrong. They had underestimated him, as many do, but now they understood that life's greatest talents are often hidden in plain sight. As the day went on, some students returned to their practice rooms, but a few lingered near the piano. They tried to play, hesitating over each note, hoping to capture a little of what he had shown them. Their attempts were clumsy, but the janitor didn't laugh. He walked past them, offering small corrections and gentle encouragement. His patience, his kindness, and his understanding touched them in ways they couldn't explain. By the time the afternoon sun began to fade, the janitor had finished his work. The hall was clean, the pianos polished, and the students had learned more than they had in any formal lesson that week. They had learned about respect, humility, and the quiet power of a life lived fully, even without recognition. And most of all, they had learned that music was not just notes on a page. It was life itself. And some people carry life's music inside them in ways that cannot be measured by titles or appearances. As he walked toward the door, the students watched him go. They had a new sense of wonder and admiration. For the first time, they realized that sometimes the people who seem ordinary carry extraordinary stories. They understood that laughter without understanding can hurt, even when it seems harmless. And they felt a quiet promise forming in their hearts, a promise to pay attention, to listen, and to notice the hidden depths in others. That evening, the janitor walked home slowly. The streets were quiet and the sky was turning pink with sunset. He thought about the day, about the students, about the music that had filled the academy. He didn't feel pride or showiness. He felt contentment, a quiet joy that came from simply being able to connect through music. It was enough to know that someone had listened, even if just for a little while. And somewhere in the hearts of those students, a seed had been planted. A seed of respect, curiosity, and understanding. They had laughed at him once, yes, but now they had seen the truth. They had seen that life's beauty often hides behind ordinary faces, behind quiet smiles, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the least expected places. The janitor paused one last time at the academy's doors. Looking back at the hall filled with pianos and empty benches, he smiled faintly to himself. Not for attention or praise, but because he had shared a part of his life. And in that sharing, he had reminded everyone, in the simplest and most beautiful way, that music and life itself is about feeling, about connection, and about moments that touch the soul. The students still inside felt it too. They whispered among themselves, unsure how to express the awe they felt. One of them finally said, "He's incredible. I never knew." The others nodded, all of them thinking the same thing. They had seen the janitor differently now. They had seen the heart of a musician behind the hands of a man who cleaned floors. And they knew somehow that this was only the beginning of a story they would never forget. The days that followed were unlike any the music academy had seen before. The janitor arrived early as usual, carrying his cleaning supplies, his uniform neat, his shoes a little scuffed from years of daily use. But something had shifted. The students no longer ignored him or laughed. They watched him move quietly through the halls, curious and respectful. Some of them lingered near the piano before their lessons, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man who had amazed them so deeply. The janitor went about his work with the same calm dedication as always. He swept the floors, polished the pianos, and emptied the bins filled with discarded sheet music. But now, when he passed by the students, some of them smiled or nodded. A few even greeted him with a quiet good morning, their voices carrying a mix of nervousness and admiration. He returned their greetings with a gentle nod, never showing pride, only the quiet warmth that had always been part of him. One afternoon, the academy's main hall was unusually empty. A few students were practicing in smaller rooms, the corridors echoing with soft notes of piano music. The janitor moved slowly through the hall, wiping dust from the edges of the grand piano near the center. He paused for a moment, resting his hands lightly on the polished surface. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the feel of the keys under his fingers, the way music had once flowed through his life so naturally. He had been about to continue cleaning when a soft voice called from behind him, "Sir, would you play something for us again?" It was one of the students who had lingered near the piano for days, a boy with shy eyes and a careful way of speaking. The janitor looked at him surprised, though his expression remained calm. "I don't know if it's the right time," he said softly, almost hesitantly. But there was no mockery in his tone, only quiet consideration. The student stepped closer. "Please. Just a few notes," he whispered. We want to understand." The janitor hesitated, then gently set down his cleaning cloth. He moved toward the piano, sliding the bench into place, and sat down. His fingers hovered over the keys, not pressing them yet, just feeling their smooth surface. feeling the memory of years of music in his hands. Then he began to play. The first notes were slow, soft, almost like a whisper in the empty hall. The students who had gathered, now silent and still, could feel the sound wrapping around them. It was not a performance meant to impress, not a show of skill, but a story told in music. A story of patience, of loss, of quiet strength. Each note seemed to carry emotion that words could never fully capture. The melody grew, delicate and flowing. It was beautiful, but it was also sad. The students could feel the depth of his experience, the long years he had spent away from the stage, the sacrifices he had made, and the moments of quiet longing that had filled his life. They watched as his hands moved effortlessly over the keys, each motion precise yet full of feeling. His eyes were closed, but his expression told a story of someone who had loved and lost, who had carried dreams quietly for years, who had found solace in music even when life had demanded otherwise. As the music continued, a few students began to realize that they were not just hearing notes, they were hearing a life story. Every pause, every chord, every rise and fall of the melody carried meaning. They felt emotions they could not name: admiration, wonder, sadness, and a strange warmth that seemed to fill the hall. It was as if the man was speaking directly to their hearts without saying a single word. The boy who had first asked him to play watched in awe, his eyes wide. He felt a lump in his throat and struggled to keep from tears. He had laughed at this man just days before along with the others. Now he saw how wrong he had been. This quiet janitor, who had seemed ordinary in every way, had a depth and a gift that none of them had understood. When the janitor paused for a moment to take a breath, the room remained completely still. The students did not move, did not speak, as if afraid to disturb the fragile magic that lingered in the air. The man's eyes opened slowly, meeting theirs for the first time in the performance. There was no pride, no arrogance, only calmness and something else, a quiet hope that they could understand. One of the girls, the same who had asked him to play the day before, whispered, How can someone be so good and yet work here? I don't understand." The janitor smiled faintly, a soft, knowing smile that held years of experience. "Life is not always about where you perform or how people see you," he said gently. "Sometimes it is about what you do quietly, what you carry inside, what you never let go of even when the world moves on." The students felt the weight of his words, though they were simple. They realized that he had not chosen this life because he lacked talent. He had chosen it because life demanded it, because circumstances had led him here, and yet he had not abandoned the thing he loved most. Music was still alive in him, even if the world had not noticed. The janitor returned to the piano and continued to play. This time the notes were lighter, almost joyful, but still filled with emotion. It was as if he was telling the students that even after hardship there is beauty, even after sorrow there is hope. The students began to understand that his music was not just skill. It was heart, it was experience. It was life itself poured through his fingers. A few students tried to play along, softly pressing the keys, hoping to capture even a fraction of what they were hearing. The janitor guided them gently, showing them small adjustments, pointing out subtle rhythms, teaching them not with words but with patience and example. They felt their respect for him growing with each note, each touch of the keys, each moment shared in silence and music. Hours passed, but the students did not leave. They wanted to learn, to listen, to understand. Some stayed even after their own lessons had ended, quietly observing, trying to absorb the depth of what they had witnessed. The janitor did not rush them, did not push them away. He moved among them with quiet grace, encouraging, correcting, guiding, but never speaking harshly. His humility made them admire him more. As evening approached, the sunlight faded, casting long shadows across the hall. The janitor finished his work, the hall sparkling clean, the pianos polished, and the students filled with a new sense of wonder. They had learned something far beyond scales and chords. They had learned about patience, humility, and the quiet power of life experience. They had learned that true talent can be hidden in the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the people we overlook carry stories and gifts that can change us forever. Before leaving, the janitor paused at the piano one last time. His fingers rested lightly on the keys. He closed his eyes and played a few soft, simple notes, not a full melody, just enough to leave a quiet echo in the hall. Then he stood, gathered his cleaning supplies and walked out slowly, the echo of his footsteps blending with the fading sound of his music. The students remained, sitting quietly, absorbing what had happened. They had laughed at him once, yes, but now they understood. They had seen the truth. They had seen a man who carried decades of music, love, and life in his heart, who had chosen to continue quietly despite the world moving on without him. That night, the boy who had first asked him to play stayed late in the hall. He sat at the piano, fingers trembling as he tried to play the few notes he remembered. It didn't sound the same. He realized it never could. The music he had heard came not from technique alone but from life itself, from the quiet strength of a man who had survived loss and carried beauty in his soul. The girl with bright eyes returned the next day. She quietly practiced, letting the music flow slowly, trying to feel the emotion the janitor had shared. With each note, she understood a little more. Music was not just sound, and it was connection, emotion, and the reflection of the heart. By the end of the week, more students lingered near the piano, shyly asking him questions, softly requesting guidance, eager to understand the depth behind his quiet presence. The janitor answered them patiently, never rushing, never speaking harshly, only teaching through gentle words and example. He had become more than a janitor in their eyes. He was a teacher of life, of patience, of quiet strength, and of music that spoke deeper than words. The academy had changed, too. The atmosphere shifted subtly, becoming one of respect and quiet admiration. Students treated the janitor differently now, with kindness and curiosity. Teachers, too, noticed the transformation. They began to pay attention to him, to acknowledge the care he gave to the instruments, the gentle way he moved through the halls, the subtle wisdom he carried without ever speaking loudly or demanding recognition. And while he never sought attention or praise, the janitor felt a quiet satisfaction. He had shared a part of himself, something deeply personal, with those who were willing to listen. In return, he saw the students growing, not just as musicians, but as people who could recognize depth, emotion, and the hidden talents in those they might otherwise overlook. Music, he realized, was not about applause or recognition. It was about connection, about life itself, and about the quiet moments that touch the soul. And for the first time in many years, he felt that his music had reached someone, that it had left a mark, however small, on the world around him. The students would remember this forever. They would never see the janitor the same way again. And though the janitor continued to work quietly day after day, sweeping floors, the next few days at the music academy were filled with quiet curiosity. The janitor continued his work as usual, cleaning floors, polishing pianos, and arranging music sheets. But there was a new air about him, a quiet respect that followed his every step. Students lingered in the halls watching him move, listening for the soft hum that sometimes escaped his lips as he worked. They were no longer simply curious about the music he could play. They wanted to understand the man behind it. One afternoon, the head teacher noticed a group of students gathered near the main hall piano. They were talking in hushed tones, glancing at the janitor as he worked. The teacher walked over, curious to see what had captured their attention so completely. When he arrived, the students gestured toward the janitor. He plays music like no one else, one of them said softly. And he's worked here for years, cleaning everything, but no one knew. The teacher nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. He had always respected the janitor's dedication, but he had never realized the depth of his talent. Sometimes the most remarkable people are quiet, he said gently. They carry stories that are not obvious at first glance. Perhaps it is time we learn more about him. The students exchanged nervous glances. They wanted to hear more, to know the story behind the music, but they didn't know how to ask. That evening, one of them finally found the courage. As the janitor swept near the piano, she approached him carefully. "Sir, if it's okay to ask, can you tell us why you stopped performing? Why you chose to live quietly here?" The janitor paused. His eyes softened as he looked at the students, recognizing their sincerity. He set his broom aside and motioned for them to sit on the benches nearby. He began slowly, almost as if testing whether he could put his life into words. "Music has always been my life," he said, his voice calm but carrying a quiet weight. "From the moment I touched a piano as a child, I knew it would stay with me forever. I dreamed of performing on grand stages, sharing music with audiences who could feel what I felt. And for a time I did. The students listened intently, leaning forward. They could feel the passion in his voice, the longing that had carried him through his years. He continued, I performed in small theaters and halls. I taught students. I played for people who understood music the way I did. But life has a way of changing plans. There were responsibilities I could not ignore. Family matters, personal losses, things that demanded my attention, my presence, and so I left the stage. He paused, his fingers brushing lightly over the edge of the piano as if remembering the countless hours he had spent playing. It was not easy, he admitted quietly. I loved music more than anything, but I could not abandon those who needed me. I gave up my dreams, but I never gave up music itself. Even now I find a way to be near it, to keep it alive in my heart, even if I cannot perform as I once did. The students were silent. They had not expected such honesty, such vulnerability. They had laughed at him, teased him, and yet here he was sharing the most personal parts of his life without complaint or bitterness. They realized that the man they had underestimated carried both pain and beauty inside him, and that his music was a reflection of everything he had lived through. One of the boys, who had once mocked him, spoke quietly. I didn't know. I didn't realize. The janitor smiled softly, shaking his head. It is natural, he said. People often see only what is in front of them. They do not see the years, the choices, the sacrifices that shape a person. That is not wrong. But now you know a little more. That is enough. He moved back to the piano and rested his hands on the keys, not playing yet. Music is not just about performance, he said gently. It is about connection, about emotion, about life itself. Every note I play carries a part of me. The joys, the sorrows, the moments that made me who I am. Even when no one is listening, I play. Even when life demands something else, I play. That is my truth. The students looked at him with awe. They had never realized that music could carry such meaning, such history, such depth. They understood now that talent was not only about skill or speed or technique. It was about heart, about experience, about the story behind every note. And in that moment, they felt a deep respect for the janitor, who had quietly shared so much without ever asking for recognition. Over the next few days, a subtle change took place in the academy. The students who had once mocked him now approached him with curiosity and respect. They asked questions not to challenge him but to learn. They wanted to understand how someone could create such emotion through music, how he had remained true to his art despite life's hardships, and he in turn answered them patiently, guiding their fingers on the keys, showing them the subtle shifts in rhythm and tone, teaching them to feel rather than just play. One afternoon, he decided to tell them a little more about his past. He spoke about his childhood, about the first piano he had touched and the teachers who had nurtured his talent. He spoke about the excitement of his early performances, the thrill of playing for an audience who could hear the story behind every note. He told them about the friends he had made, the music he had written, and the small victories that had made him feel alive. Then quietly, he spoke about loss. He told them about someone he had loved deeply, someone who had inspired his music, whose absence had left a gap that nothing could fill. He described the pain of saying goodbye, the way life sometimes forces people to choose between love and duty. His voice did not waver, but it carried the weight of those memories. The students listened, tears forming in their eyes, moved not just by his words but by the honesty, the courage, and the humanity he displayed. Through his stories, they began to understand why he worked as a janitor. It was not because he lacked talent or ambition, but because life had demanded he put others first. Yet he had not abandoned his passion. He had found a way to remain connected to music, to keep it alive in his heart, and to share it in small, meaningful ways. The janitor's humility left a profound impact. The students realized that greatness is not always loud or visible. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and patient. Sometimes it is found in the people who go unnoticed, who work in the background, who carry burdens without complaint. And sometimes it is the courage to continue, to remain true to oneself even when life has taken unexpected turns. One evening, after the academy had emptied and the lights were dimmed, the janitor stayed behind. He walked slowly to the piano, his fingers brushing the keys. He played a few soft notes, a melody that had comforted him during difficult nights. The sound filled the empty hall, gentle and tender, carrying the essence of his life. He paused, closed his eyes, and let the music linger in the air. For him, this was not performance. It was connection. It was remembrance. It was life. The students who had stayed late watched silently from the doorway, feeling an indescribable mix of awe, admiration, and gratitude. They had laughed at him once, and now they saw the truth. They had underestimated him, as people often do, but now they understood the depth of his story, the beauty of his music, and the strength it took to carry both life and art in such balance. In the following weeks, the students approached him more often, seeking guidance, listening to his music, and learning not just about piano techniques but about life itself. They asked about his compositions, the stories behind them, and the emotions he conveyed. He answered patiently, often without words, showing them through music, through gentle corrections, and through the quiet dignity of his presence. The academy, too, began to change. Teachers noticed the way the students' attitudes shifted. They saw respect growing where once there had been teasing. They observed a new culture of appreciation, not just for skill, but for character, for patience, and for the quiet, often invisible contributions of those around them. And all of this had started with a simple act: the janitor's willingness to play, to share, to reveal a piece of himself in the most honest way possible. For the janitor, it was never about recognition. He had no desire for applause, no need for fame. He played because it was part of him, because it brought him peace, and because he understood more than most that true art is a gift, not a performance. And yet, he could not deny the quiet satisfaction he felt when the students listened with attention, when they asked questions, when they began to see music as he had always seen it, as life itself, rich with emotion, story, and meaning. The days following the janitor's stories and performances were filled with a quiet energy at the music academy. The students had changed. They no longer saw the janitor as just someone who cleaned floors and polished instruments. They began to notice the subtle ways he cared for the academy, the gentle attention he gave to the pianos, and the patience he showed when helping anyone who asked. But most importantly, they began to see him as a man whose music carried life itself. One morning, a group of students gathered near the main hall piano before their classes. They were whispering quietly, glancing at the janitor, their curiosity and admiration written on their faces. The janitor arrived carrying his cleaning supplies as usual, but something had shifted. He noticed the students waiting, their eyes bright and expectant. He smiled softly, not for praise, but because he understood what they wanted. "Would you play for us again?" one of the students asked hesitantly. The question was quiet, almost reverent. The janitor nodded gently. "If you would like," he said softly. He placed his supplies aside and walked toward the piano, sliding the bench into place. He sat down and rested his hands lightly on the keys. The hall grew silent, every student holding their breath. Then he began to play. The notes were soft at first, gentle, almost like a conversation with the empty room. As the melody developed, it became richer, flowing smoothly, carrying emotion and memory. The students watched, captivated, feeling the depth in every sound. They could sense the life behind the music, the years of struggle, the moments of quiet happiness, the losses he had endured, and the joy he had found in small victories. As he played, something unexpected began to happen. The students felt tears welling in their eyes, unbidden, moved by the power of the music and the sincerity behind it. They realized that this was not just skill on display. This was a story being told without words. A story of life itself, of love, of loss, and of hope. Every note seemed to reach into their hearts, speaking directly to their emotions. One of the students, a boy who had been quiet and reserved, stepped closer to the piano. "Sir, your music." "It's like it's alive," he whispered. The janitor paused for a moment, looking at him. "Music reflects life," he said softly. "It carries the moments we cannot speak, the feelings we cannot describe. That is why I play." The students felt the truth in his words. They began to understand that talent alone did not make his music extraordinary. It was the depth of experience, the patience, the resilience, and the honesty in every note that made it remarkable. They felt humbled, recognizing how much they had underestimated him in the past. After he finished, there was a long silence. No one spoke at first. Then the students began to clap, slowly at first, then more loudly, until the hall echoed with their appreciation. The janitor stood smiling faintly and bowed with quiet grace. He did not play for applause, but it was clear that he had touched every person in the room. Over the next week, the impact of his music spread further. Students who had never interacted with him began to approach, asking questions, seeking guidance, or simply listening quietly as he played. Some asked about the pieces he performed, others about the emotions behind them. The janitor answered patiently, not rushing, guiding them with gentle words and subtle corrections. He did not act as a teacher demanding respect, but as someone who shared wisdom naturally, letting the students feel and discover for themselves. One afternoon, a group of students asked if he could teach them a few pieces he had once composed. He hesitated at first, but then nodded. He moved slowly, carefully, showing them small adjustments in hand placement and rhythm. He explained that music was not just about playing the correct notes, but about feeling the story behind the melody. The students listened intently, trying to absorb not only the technique but the emotion, the meaning, the life that went into every sound. As the days passed, the students' skills improved, but more importantly, so did their understanding of music itself. They began to approach practice with patience and thoughtfulness, learning to listen to the music and to each other. The janitor's presence had changed the culture of the academy. It was no longer just about talent or competition. It was about connection, empathy, and expression. One evening after the academy had emptied, the janitor stayed behind. He walked to the piano, fingers brushing lightly over the keys. He began to play a piece he had composed years ago, a melody full of hope and sorrow intertwined. The sound filled the empty hall, rich and alive, carrying the essence of his experiences. For him, it was not performance. It was remembrance, connection, and release. A few students who had stayed late listened quietly from the doorway. They could feel the emotion in the music, a depth that went beyond technical skill. Some felt tears form, unable to explain why the music moved them so deeply. They realized that what he played was more than notes. It was a story, a life, a part of his soul shared without reserve. The janitor's influence began to extend beyond the students. Teachers noticed the change in the atmosphere. The academy seemed warmer, more attentive, more appreciative of the quiet dedication that had always existed but had gone unnoticed. They began to acknowledge the janitor's contributions, not only for his work in maintaining the space but for the inspiration he provided. He did not ask for recognition, but it came naturally because of the respect he had earned. One day, a music competition was scheduled in the academy. Students were nervous, preparing intensely, but there was an undercurrent of excitement and admiration for the janitor. Many of them had come to realize that true artistry was not only in their own hands, but in the understanding of music as a reflection of life. The janitor quietly watched from the sidelines, offering guidance when asked and encouragement when needed. Before the competition, a few students approached him.
"Sir,
Could you play a piece to inspire us?" they asked softly. He hesitated, but then agreed, moving to the piano as they watched. His fingers rested lightly on the keys, and then he began to play. The melody flowed through the hall, soft at first, then stronger, carrying a sense of courage and calm. The students who would compete felt their nerves settle. They could hear not only the notes but the meaning, the patience, the quiet strength in every sound. As the competition began, many of the students found themselves drawing on the lesson the janitor had taught them, that music was not just about perfection or speed, but about expression and connection. Their performances carried emotion, sincerity, and presence influenced by the quiet guidance they had received. Teachers and judges noticed, remarking on the depth in the students' performances, unaware that the janitor had played a part in shaping it. The janitor remained in the background throughout, quietly observing, smiling faintly as he watched. He did not seek recognition, but he understood the subtle influence he had on the students. They were learning more than piano. They were learning humility, patience, empathy, and the importance of listening and feeling. After the competition, the students gathered around the janitor, expressing their gratitude. "Sir, your music, it changed the way we play. It changed the way we think," one of them said. Another added, "We used to laugh, but now we understand. You've taught us more than any lesson could." The janitor's eyes softened and he nodded gently. "I'm glad you understand," he said quietly. "Music is a gift. It is not about recognition. It is about sharing, feeling, and connecting." From that day on, the janitor became a quiet legend in the academy. He did not seek attention, but his influence was undeniable. Students who had once ignored him now approached him for guidance, inspiration, and support. Teachers acknowledged him, not only for his dedication but for the lessons he imparted without words, through music, patience, and humility. The janitor continued his routine, cleaning floors, polishing pianos, and sweeping the halls, but now with a sense of fulfillment he had not felt in years. He had shared a piece of himself, his life and his music, and in doing so, he had touched hearts, inspired minds, and taught lessons that went far beyond the classroom. Even the students who had once laughed at him carried a new respect. They understood now that greatness is not always visible, that talent can be hidden behind quiet hands and humble appearances. They realized that the deepest lessons often come from unexpected sources, and that the beauty of life is sometimes found in the simplest, quietest moments. As weeks passed, the janitor's music continued to resonate. Students played with greater emotion, teachers guided with more patience, and the academy itself felt warmer, more connected. And somewhere deep in the hearts of those who listened, the lessons of respect, empathy, and understanding remained, shaping their lives in ways that would endure long after the notes had faded. At the end of the day, the janitor would leave the academy as he always did, carrying his supplies, quietly closing the doors behind him. Yet the impact of his presence, his patience, and his music lingered. The students would remember him, not as a janitor but as a teacher of life, a guardian of music, and a man whose quiet dedication had transformed an entire community. The academy had been changed, not by grand performances or loud accolades, but by the steady, gentle presence of a man who had never stopped believing in the power of music. His story was no longer hidden, and though he did not seek recognition, it came. The academy was quiet that morning, the soft light of dawn streaming through the tall windows. The janitor arrived as usual, carrying his cleaning supplies, the routine familiar and comforting. But today felt different, though he could not say why. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that something was about to change. The students had been buzzing with anticipation all week, though they did not reveal the source of their excitement. Some whispered in corners, others exchanged knowing glances, all of them curious and eager. They had been touched by the janitor's music and patience, and they had been planning something quietly, a way to honor the man who had changed their understanding of music and life itself. As he began his work, sweeping the floors and arranging the pianos, he noticed the students gathering near the main hall. Their faces were serious yet smiling, full of energy and expectation. One of the students stepped forward, speaking on behalf of the group. "Sir, today we would like to invite you to perform in front of the entire academy," the student said softly but firmly. "We want everyone to see what we have seen, to hear the music you've shared with us." The janitor paused, surprised. He had never sought recognition, had never imagined standing on a stage again, and the idea of performing for an audience, even one he knew, stirred a quiet nervousness in him. He shook his head gently. I don't know if that is right. I have not performed publicly in years," he said, his voice calm but hesitant. The students' faces were sincere, filled with respect and hope. "We understand, but we've seen how your music moves people," another student said. "You've taught us more than any lesson could. Please, let us share that with everyone." He looked around the hall at the eager faces of the students and at the polished pianos waiting in quiet rows. There was a warmth in their eyes, a silent trust that touched him deeply. For the first time in years, he felt a stirring of courage. He nodded slowly. "Very well," he said softly. "If this will help others understand music, I will play." Word spread quickly. By mid-morning, the hall was filled with students, teachers, and even some parents. There was an air of excitement and anticipation, tinged with curiosity. Many had seen him before, but few had witnessed the depth of his talent. Some remembered the laughter from before, but now those memories felt distant and wrong. They were about to see a different side of a man they had underestimated for too long. The janitor approached the piano, his steps steady but deliberate. The audience fell silent as he took his seat, resting his hands lightly on the keys. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic introduction. He simply looked at the piano, then at the people before him, and began to play. The first notes were soft, delicate, almost like a whisper in the vast hall. Slowly the melody grew, carrying emotion, experience, and a lifetime of stories. The audience felt their hearts stir with every chord, sensing the joy, sorrow, patience, and love woven into the music. They could hear the depth of his life in each note, The years of dedication, the sacrifices made, the dreams quietly carried and never abandoned. Tears began to form in many eyes. Students who had once laughed, teachers who had underestimated him, and parents who had not expected such depth all felt the power of the music. It was not just a performance, it was a revelation. It spoke of life itself, of resilience, of quiet courage, and of the beauty that exists even in unrecognized lives. The janitor played for what seemed like hours, though it was only a short piece. Each movement of his fingers told a story. Each pause allowed the audience to feel the emotion behind the notes. Some students closed their eyes, letting the music carry them to memories, dreams, and feelings they had never shared. Others watched in awe, understanding for the first time that true artistry is not about fame, but about connecting with the human heart. When he finally lifted his hands from the keys, the hall was silent for a moment, as if no one dared breathe. Then slowly applause began, soft at first, then louder until it filled every corner of the hall. The janitor looked up, a gentle smile on his face, and nodded quietly, acknowledging the appreciation but showing no pride. The clapping continued, and some of the students, unable to contain themselves, stood and wept quietly, moved by what they had just experienced. The head teacher approached him, eyes shining. "You've reminded us all why music matters," the teacher said softly. "Not for recognition or awards, but for connection, for emotion, for life itself. You've taught more than you know." The janitor shook his head, his smile calm. "I only shared what has always been inside me," he said gently. "The rest is for those who listen to discover." One of the students stepped forward with a small notebook. "Sir, these are compositions you've shared with us over the weeks," the student said. "We wanted to show you how much your music has inspired us." The janitor took the notebook, flipping through the pages filled with music inspired by his teachings. He looked at the students with a quiet pride, not for himself, but for the growth he had seen in them. Parents and teachers approached as well, expressing their gratitude. They had seen the students' transformation, the patience, empathy, and understanding that had grown within them. And at the center of it all was the janitor, a man who had lived quietly, worked humbly, and carried music in his heart. He had touched lives without ever seeking attention, and now, finally, the world had paused to recognize what they had overlooked. After the applause settled, the janitor began to speak, his voice steady but soft. "Music is more than notes," he said. "It is more than performance. It is connection, it is life. I never played for recognition, never sought applause.
I played because it is a part of me, because it carries emotions words cannot describe.
And now I see that sharing it, even quietly, can touch others in ways we cannot imagine." The students listened, some wiping tears, others nodding in deep understanding. They realized that what they had laughed at was not ignorance or weakness. It was simply a part of life they had not yet learned to appreciate. And now, they had been given a gift, not just of music, but of life lessons, patience, humility, and empathy. The janitor returned to the piano one last time that day. He played a piece he had written long ago, a composition filled with hope, longing, and quiet strength. The hall listened, silent, each person feeling the story carried by the notes. When he finished, there was a final round of applause, longer and more heartfelt than before. This time no one hesitated. Everyone present recognized the depth of the man before them, the beauty he had carried quietly for so long. As the crowd began to disperse, the janitor quietly packed his supplies. Students approached him, thanking him, hugging him, or simply standing in silence to show respect. Teachers offered smiles of admiration, and even the parents who had attended the performance left with a sense of wonder and gratitude. For the first time, the janitor felt a sense of acknowledgement, not for fame, but for the impact he had made through his music and presence. That evening, the janitor walked home slowly. The streets were quiet, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange from the setting sun. He thought about the day, the students' faces, the applause, the tears, the gratitude, and felt a quiet satisfaction. He had shared a part of his life, and it had touched hearts. That was enough. He had never needed recognition, but seeing the understanding and appreciation in those around him reminded him that music and patience have power beyond what one can imagine. The next morning, the academy felt different. The students approached him with smiles, asking for guidance, sharing their progress, and sometimes simply sitting near him, listening quietly as he played small melodies. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Where once there had been teasing, now there was respect. Where once there had been indifference, now there was curiosity and admiration. And through it all, the janitor remained humble, continuing his work, quietly sharing music and inspiring hearts in ways that would last a lifetime. He did not seek fame, awards, or recognition. But in that moment, he understood the true meaning of success: touching lives, sharing what is in your heart, and showing others the power of patience, dedication, and quiet courage. And the students, teachers, and parents who had witnessed him knew that they had seen something extraordinary, a man whose life and music had changed the way they saw the world, reminding them that sometimes the most incredible gifts come from those we least expect. Years later, the story of the janitor and his music would still be told at the academy. Students would remember the quiet man who carried a lifetime of experience and emotion in his heart, who had played without seeking recognition, and whose melodies had touched everyone who heard them. They would remember the lessons he taught not with words, but with patience, humility, and music itself. And they would carry those lessons into their lives, always remembering that true greatness often lives quietly, waiting to be discovered by those who are willing to listen. The janitor never stopped playing, never stopped cleaning, never stopped sharing. He continued to walk through the halls, sweep the floors, polish the pianos, and touch lives in ways that no one could measure. And for the first time, he knew that the quiet years, the sacrifices, and the patience had all led to this moment, a recognition not born of fame, but of understanding, connection, and the unspoken power of music that comes from the heart. And in that